Good morning. Today we're talking about two chapters, Chapter 8, Early Modern Architecture, and we're also talking about Chapter 9, which is European Art After Cubism. This is the last two chapters, the last lecture, the last section before your first test, which will cover chapters 1 through 9. Remember, on this test on Friday, it will be open note, not open book, not open internet, so that take thorough notes and also give you a bit of a refresher or review Thursday, so you have some things to study up on. So with early modern architecture, we're looking at the turn of the century and new advancements in technologies that allowed buildings to get bigger and more open spaces. As always, here are the questions for today. The first question is list some of the new developments in modern architecture. And there's 5 questions. Make sure you fill these out. Again, make sure you are responding to the material in the text as well as the lecture, so that way you are up on the material that will be covered on the test. So some of the roots of modern architecture are this idea that architecture can improve society, or in other words, that the buildings that we inhabit, the buildings that we occupy, live in, work in, play in, can influence us, right? You can be in a particular mood, go into a building and it can change your mood. You can be working in a space and the space could be foreboding, or it could be pleasant. It could fill you with joy. It could fill you with, just dread, right? So this idea with early modern architecture was, how can architecture reflect the needs of society but also improve society? One of the very famous first architects in this new medium is Louis Sullivan, and Louis Sullivan was the teacher of Frank Lloyd Wright. He's also famous for saying form follows function, which means the building should only be as decorative as the purpose it suits, right? So first, space is most important. Secondly, the decoration of that space. Chicago becomes a really important mecca for new architecture, mostly because of the great the Great Fire of 1871, which created a clean slate, but also created a need for safer architecture. A lot of the buildings were built with wood and brick, very flammable and dangerous, right? If there's a fire, earthquake, etc. on the coast, these are some of the concerns of modern architecture. And so with steel, with the use of steel, and also glass, it becomes a sense of lighter buildings, which by buildings can be taller than. And this is an early example of what modern architecture can look like. Because if you're creating big, huge boxes, essentially, which is a skyscraper, they could be not necessarily all that decorative or beautiful. So architects have to consider, like, how do you use this new format and make them interesting? And this building, the Marshall Field Wholesale Store in Chicago, becomes sort of a blueprint for Chicago buildings and also later New York buildings of what a skyscraper is going to look like or could look like. And at this time, about the tallest you could go was about 6 stories with a traditional brick building like this. And this is rusticated stone. It's not meant to look like the Gothic architecture that was popular at the time, the new revival of Gothic buildings. Instead, it's meant to look like Romanesque buildings, so that buildings that would have been popular in the Roman Republic and during the Roman imperial times, but then also buildings in Italy. So for instance, some of the big grand palazzos or palaces in Florence and in Rome in the Renaissance in like the 15th and 16th century, it influences what these big buildings can look like in the United States. So this is sort of a blueprint. This is very foundational. Even though it's still mostly traditional construction, it is influencing the way that the buildings after, using new materials. This is a great example. This is a building by Louis Sullivan, who was very famous for saying form follows function. So the first aim or goal of an architect is to make the building suit its purpose. What are some of the new materials here? What are some of the new innovative materials? Well, steel. Production of steel had become easier to do, cheaper to do, and also much more strong and strengthened these buildings. So they become essentially just an empty shell. You don't have to have a lot of buttresses or columns on the interior or supports, piers, kind of in the traditional construction, load-bearing construction of making the lower floors really, really thick, like in this case, and then they can get thinner, lighter as they go up. The building is very, very consistent throughout, and you had much larger open spaces because of this metal shell and really a glass exterior. This has terracotta that's been applied to it, so basically that's the decorative aspects. And a lot of people have talked about how early skyscrapers, because there was a worry that they were just going to be too vertical, that Louis Sullivan here creates, again, sort of blueprint or a foundation, what future skyscrapers will look like. And this is really, a prototypical skyscraper. You can get about, the early skyscrapers were generally about 10 to 14 floors. Eventually later, you're getting 50, 60, and plus floors. Essentially the same concept, though, just modular repeating elements. But this building, which is now, which is in Buffalo, New York, inspires buildings in Chicago, which is ironic because Louis Sullivan mostly works in Chicago, as well as his understudy, Frank Lloyd Wright, who strikes out on his own. But this building is in Buffalo, New York. It influences later buildings in New York City, buildings in Chicago. And there's something about, excuse me, I'm sorry. There's something about the structure of it that's reminiscent of earlier architectural forms, and it's kind of the three-part section of a column, like an Ionic column or like a Doric column, which has a base, which we can see here, sort of the base of the column, the main shaft of the column, and then the decorative capital at the top, which sort of resembles a column like this. And thinking about different decorative columns, whether it's Ionic or Doric, this is essentially, this column goes from being an architectural element to the all-encompassing structure itself. And he couldn't just leave it the shell, the steel innards on the outside. He addresses it with terracotta, which is again looking at earlier architectural forms as well. So it's kind of looking back as well as looking forward, because nothing really looked like this before. Internal metal structure, clad in terracotta, an emphasis on verticality, and that's mainly because the necessity of these buildings to house many, many offices, or later in the case of apartment buildings, many individual dwellings, that it's going to have a lot of sense of verticality. The height is exaggerated. And almost has these, looks like these individual little piers or columns that go all the way up uninterrupted, and then at the top these decorative elements here. Very beautiful, harmonic, really great sense of rhythm and repetition, really beautiful early example of a skyscraper, and then how this can influence skyscrapers that come after it. As I mentioned, Frank Lloyd Wright is a student of Louis Sullivan. He was an early partner, worked with him, studied under Louis Sullivan in Chicago. Frank Lloyd Wright took a lot of those ideas from John Ruskin, arts and crafts. Remember we talked about how arts and crafts movement first in Europe, then later comes to the United States, kind of early examples of Art Nouveau, its predecessor. And you can see that influence in Frank Lloyd Wright becomes very, very iconic and modern and cutting edge. Now what's happening though is in the city like Chicago or New York City, where Frank Lloyd Wright was designing buildings and skyscrapers with Louis Sullivan, there was a lot of verticality. There was this sense of that the cities were going to get dark and block out the light. So as a way of compensating for that and contrasting that, Frank Lloyd Wright makes some of his prairie-style homes much more horizontal to contrast the verticality of these modern industrial city spaces, right? So the horizontal aesthetic contrasts the verticality of the city. Very, very beautiful. Vocab word, cantilever. So this is cantilevered right here, which we see in a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright's work, especially in his mature work like Falling Water in Pennsylvania. Cantilever means an extension or a span that continues out or juts out over a building. And you can have spaces below those and spaces above those. It's kind of like it's supported from within. Really new, interesting, innovative, and Frank Lloyd Wright uses it to great aesthetic, but also purposeful use in his work. He's influenced by Japanese architecture. You think about the screens like in the tea ceremony rooms. There's a lot of influence in that. This is his early mature style. He becomes really, really popular, very sought after, until he has a little bit of personal turmoil in his life. People kind of shied away from some of his designs, and there was more of a return to ornamental, decorative work and kind of shying away from this modern aesthetic until later in life he was able to get some more commissions like the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. This is an example too, just like we talked about Mackintosh with art and crafts movement. Frank Lloyd Wright really wanted to design the entire experience, the floor, the walls, the ceiling, but also the interior decoration, the interior design, like mounting built-ins, right? So different shelves and counter space, that's part of the architectural structure, creating a continued sense of harmony and movement. But also the tables, the chairs, and these kind of mission-style exaggerated chairs, similar to kind of Charles McIntosh's work. But here we see a unique interpretation of arts and crafts in the United States. This is the Roby House, named after the patron that commissioned the house, and a very, very famous early example of modernism. Just a beautiful, this is a masterpiece. If you talk about masterpieces, this is one of Frank Lloyd Wright's masterpieces. Here, this is another work that happens after the destruction of Taliesin. Taliesin was the home that Frank Lloyd Wright built for himself and his second wife. He had highly publicized personal problems. He left his first wife and he left his 6 children, moved in with his second wife in this house that he built for himself in Wisconsin called Taliesin. It was destroyed. It was burned to the ground by a servant who also killed his new wife and 2 of her children and 4 house guests. Frank Lloyd Wright was not killed, but this really did him a lot of personal and business damage, as people didn't kind of want to touch him after this really kind of awful, horrific event that happened in his personal life. Not a lot of people know about this either, and I think sometimes people glaze over the fact that Frank Lloyd Wright had some bad personal decisions and some tragedies that happened. A lot of times they just focus on the positive aspects of the promise, the aesthetics of his architecture. But this building, the Imperial Hotel, happens right before that. So this is 1912. He begins it before his new wife was murdered and his house was destroyed. But look at how long he continues this. For 11 years he works on this. And I want you to pause this and see if you can guess some of his influences here. What does this building no longer exist? It survived an earthquake and then later was demolished as it became kind of in disrepair and not as popular as a hotel. But this hotel served Westerners visiting Tokyo in Japan at first. So what influenced Frank Lloyd Wright on this? Can you see other examples of art or architecture in this building? Pause it. Some of his influences include Eastern architecture, like pagodas in China and Japan. Also temple architecture, Mayan temple architecture in Mexico, like Aztec and Mayan architecture. So it has this kind of personal, private, Japanese kind of tea ceremony influence, but also religious aspects, right, with shrine and pagoda and Aztec and Mayan temple architecture. So really, really interesting, really, really beautiful. And this was influential on modern architecture. Unfortunately, it no longer exists, but a complement to what he's doing with some of his domestic architecture, using some of those ideas in commercial spaces as well. This is a really well-known architect, Adolf Loos. Adolf Loos was active in Vienna, and you can see the influence of Art Nouveau and the Vienna Secessionists, which we saw that portrait that was done of Adolf Loos earlier when we were talking about Vienna Secessionism. But we see this beautiful barrel vaulted kind of half dome. Barrel vault means a circular dome-like continuous structure. So a barrel vault would look like, instead of this, like post and lintel architecture, it has a space kind of carved in it like this, and as it goes back into space like this, that barrel vault continues inside of there, right? That kind of looks like a nice little loaf of bread. Barrel vault. So you have a half dome space here. Beautiful architecture. It's punctuated randomly almost by windows in the side of the facade, and in the front it's a beautiful kind of cubist-like use of architecture in space. Becomes very, very influential. And here is the front of this Steiner house in Vienna. Really beautiful use of materials. So from one view it looks very modern and futuristic, and then from the front, from the entrance, from the street view, I feel like it has much more of a traditional cottage type vibe to it. So it's kind of merging old and new. What are some of the materials here? Plaster, stone, metal. So using materials and a new way of doing materials. So this also has concrete as well. So reinforced concrete, one of the earliest applications of it in a private house. So an innovative use of material, honestly, it's been around since the Romans. Buildings like the Colosseum, the Pantheon had cast concrete in them, but relatively new in modern architecture and the first application of it in a private house. So what you could do is you could build a form with wood and then pour concrete into it, remove the wooden form, and basically you have an inhabitable sculpture. And so that's why you can get some of these really beautiful, interesting, dynamic forms that would be a little bit more difficult to do with brick or steel or something that you have to manipulate, right? Another interesting, much more symbolic building, it's not a functional building, it's more of a memorial, is this building by Joseph Maria Albrecht in Germany. And this was dedicated to the second wedding of the German Archduke at this time in 1907. And it's cool because I can see an influence of Art Nouveau and the decorative aspects, the ornamental aspects, this kind of asymmetry here, these little punctuated windows. And then at the top, what does that look like at the top there? These four little individual forms, or rather five, like an outreached hand, like imagine the bride removing her glove and someone putting a ring on it, right? So this is kind of the symbolism that Albrecht used in this building, which is more of a part of an architectural complex and more of a focal point as opposed to a building that had a particular purpose. But I love this, a really interesting building, and it influences kind of the modern ideals and aesthetics of early modern architecture. One of the most influential architects of the early 20th century is this architect, Peter Behrens. Peter Behrens is a German architect, and his idea goes back to this concept of architecture can benefit society or improve society, right? So this is actually a turbine factory that was commissioned by this company, AEG, which is, they created turbines. Turbine for like technology for machine motors, and what he wanted to do was create a scene that a place where you could work almost like a church that was open with a lot of light coming into the windows. Beautiful sense of space, so that the architecture itself wasn't overwhelming or a dirty, dingy place to work. Also, in terms of his contribution to modern architecture, he taught later architects who were very prominent and also pushed the envelope of what architecture could do, including Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, and Le Corbusier, who we'll talk about later as part of the Bauhaus art movement and construction. He was part of this alliance of artists and architects called the German Work or Craft Alliance. And so this gave him a lot of commissions and also influenced, kind of taught a younger group of architects how to use this idea of benefiting modern society as opposed to stifling or limiting this. So it's a place you would go to work, but it should be an inspiring place, an airy space, that workplace that's well lit with all of these great windows in it. Interesting building. This is a visionary artist. This is kind of a unique artist and architect. Even though he wasn't really traditionally trained as an architect, he did some buildings, including this one, Rudolf Steiner. This is his building that is really interesting because just like Adolf Loos was a building made in poured concrete. And the structure originally was built in brick but was destroyed, and so he later builds it with this poured cast concrete structure as an example of kind of like utopian architecture, idealistic views of what architecture could be or look like. Imagine at the time in the 1920s, architects are saying, wow, what's going on now? What's going to happen in the future? And so it's this sense of like modernism, modern architecture, I think always looks modern. Even if it was done in the 1920s, it looks like it could have been built today, and it still looks very futuristic, timeless, and modern. And it's based on Gaudi architecture, but it later influences an art movement called Brutalism. Rudolf Steiner had some interesting views spiritually and culturally. He started a society called the Theosophical Society, which was this sort of metaphysical practice of philosophy, theology, a kind of a merging of religion and philosophy. And he actually founded this Waldorf education, which is kind of like this holistic idea. And the Rudolf Steiner School started in the United States, indebted to his teachings about how to learn, how to study, how to better yourself. And he was very famous for giving lectures on many different topics: science, religion, physics, philosophy. His ideas about education, his ideas about this Theosophy Society. And one of his assistants realized these drawings were so beautiful that he replaced the chalkboard with big, long pieces of black paper. And at the end of these lectures, he kept them. These have later been exhibited. They're very beautiful, interesting, poetic, esoteric drawings about the nature of things and how things work. Really interesting work. But you can see the influence later. Now, this isn't from modern architecture. It's kind of mid-century modern architecture in the 1960s, an art movement called Brutalism, which is influenced by kind of the brutish quality of concrete and cast concrete. This is Brunel University in London. This art movement, Brutalism, becomes really popular in Eastern European countries, in Russia, the former Soviet Union, in England, parts of Germany. Not as much in the United States, but there are some buildings in the United States that use Brutalism, and it was definitely influenced by Rudolf Steiner's utopian vision of what futuristic architecture should look like. This, though, became synonymous with poverty. So a lot of the structures in London built in the brutalist method or modality later become low-income housing. And so people felt stifled by this architecture, and a lot of people that maybe were raised in that environment came to hate it and despise it because, if you didn't feel very good about yourself, if you didn't feel good about the fact that you were kind of neglected, shut off from the rest of society, you start to blame the architecture. So it's interesting that some of these architects that had the idea that architecture could go to benefit society and the individual and refine them and make them feel better about the surroundings, ultimately the exact opposite happens with this conclusion of modern architecture. The next chapter that we'll talk about, chapter 9, is European art after Cubism, which is a bit of a misnomer. What happens is there's so many different short, unique art movements that happen in a short span of time after Cubism, that there's no one prevailing like Impressionism or Post-Impressionism or Cubism. And it's also a bit of a misnomer because also Cubism is still really, really popular. So it's kind of like after Cubism, but still during and under the influence of Cubism, which we will see as we unpack these works. The first artist that really doesn't belong to a particular art movement is this artist Marc Chagall. Marc Chagall's work is very beautiful, very iconic, very poetic though. So he's indebted to the symbolist artists like Odilon Redon and others, where you kind of get this sense of art being symbolic of a story or a poem. He was good friends with the poet Apollinaire, who we've talked about ran in circles with Matisse and Picasso. Picasso and Matisse made work dedicated to Apollinaire. Here we can see this piece by Marc Chagall is also an homage to Apollinaire, which he has his name here written down, Apollinaire, and also Walden, the poet, and he's influenced by their writings. What does this look like in the background here, this circle with numbers on it? It's a clock. It's meant to represent time and the passage of time. And he's making a comparison. These two conjoined figures sharing two separate torsos but sharing one set of legs is meant to represent Adam and Eve. So he uses Christian, he's Jewish, he's a Russian Jew, living in what's now modern Belarus. Belarus was part of the former Soviet Union, part of Russia. Belarus is now an independent sovereign country. And there is a museum dedicated to Marc Chagall in Belarus, where he worked later in his life at the museum. It's interesting because they trace his roots of work and influence of artists like Gauguin, who I think you can see clearly here, and other symbolist artists as well. So this painting is colorful, also inspired by Fauvis like Matisse, but using Cubism as well. You can kind of see there's an eyeball here, a clock, things just kind of put together that seem haphazard or random, just like this work as well. And similar to Picasso, he was inspired by mythological themes, like in the lower right here is the Roman god Janus. You can see Janus is the Roman god of doorways. Down here, you can see this weird cat with a human head, these figures that are kind of walking sideways, a train that is upside down. So it's kind of real and unreal. Later, this terminology gets coined surrealism by Andre Breton, and artists like Salvador Dali take and run with this. But in 1913, this was so ahead of its time, no one had a name for it yet, and Marc Chagall was really exploring symbolism and kind of poetic aspirations, almost abstracted poetic elements. You can see the Eiffel Tower, and this is called Paris Through the Window. This was looking out of his apartment. He could see Paris, although he could not see the Eiffel Tower from his window. So it's kind of almost like a collage of all these separate elements, which kind of makes sense for Cubism too with this sky. You can see the Cubist influence in his work as well. Another really unique artist that has kind of a singular stylistic vision, doing things not like anyone else at the time, is Giorgio de Chirico. De Chirico is an Italian artist, and it's interesting because it has some random things that are happening here. A little bit of modern architecture, a little bit of Hellenistic Greek sculpture, which you would have been able to see these juxtapositions, this train in the background, so kind of like modern and earlier influence, this kind of Roman arch here that could have been from ancient Roman architecture, a juxtaposition of these different time periods all superimposed one over top of the other. But there's something weird about de Chirico's work, and here we can see what he calls metaphysical. There's an emphasis on things that are ominous, things that are unusual and kind of feel dreamlike. De Chirico is also what we call a proto-surrealist, because surrealism wasn't a thing yet. But later, the Surrealist artists were influenced by Giorgio de Chirico and also by Marc Chagall. Here's a really famous piece of his, very iconic. What do you feel when you look at this piece? Okay, I want you to pause this and write down a response. What do you feel about this painting? How does it make you feel if you were in this space, if the space was real? So part of here, what is happening is this idea of the metaphysical, which the metaphysical is an idea that strangeness and surprise and shock can happen as a result of this kind of ominous feeling, kind of thinking about ideas of like Freud, the unconscious, the subconscious. So metaphysical. This is proto-surrealism. You can imagine this being an Italian street, maybe a back alley. There's this train cart here, open. Most of the composition is in shadow on the right half here. And then you see this figure, this girl spinning a hoop as a toy. She's spinning the hoop with a stick, and she's going down, and you see this foreboding, ominous figure. It fills me with a sense of mystery and fear. I don't imagine that this figure is one that is going to be welcoming to this girl here. So it creates a sense of mystery. We don't know how the story is going to end, but it creates a sense of unfamiliarity, but also a sense of tension. Anything could happen, and possibly that anything could be good, that anything could be bad. So this is proto-surrealism, before surrealism is really a thing. The next art movement is futurism. This is an art movement in Italy, and one of the things that they were really interested in is the avant-garde, being able to replace the history of the past. These artists felt like museums and libraries and spaces like galleries at the time were mausoleums. They were showing dead culture from early Italy, you know, thinking about the Renaissance artists, thinking about the Roman Republic and these vestiges of earlier cultures. They wanted revolution. They wanted new art. They wanted a new country. They wanted Italy to stretch out throughout Europe and kind of reimagine its historic past of the Roman Republic. They were actually for war. And later, you know, with the Italian movement of fascism and the rise of Mussolini aligning himself with Hitler, they could have never imagined what happened. But idealistically, after World War I, they felt like that the aspects of war could create a new, better society, obliterating the old society and the old art and the old culture. But Italian futurism as a movement really isn't a unified whole. So some of the artists are Umberto Boccioni, the older teacher, Giacomo Balla, B-A-L-L-A, Severini, and also other artists, but these are kind of the big names here. This is an early painting by Umberto Boccioni, and it shows a train station in the cubist mode of fractured reality and kind of trains coming and going. And see how the letters are here? This was an homage to the collage type style of Picasso in his works around this same time. This work was exhibited, and this group of futurists, this futurism art movement was shown first in Paris and then later circulated to London, Berlin, Brussels, Amsterdam, and Munich. So its influence spread throughout Europe, and a lot of people were taken by not really a cohesive style, but a new mentality. They even wrote manifestos. So the founding of futurism starts with a manifesto that talks about what they set out to do, sort of a blueprint. So this writing, almost like an artist statement of this collective of artists saying, here's what we're going to try to do with our art. And later, it's not as much a style, a cohesive style where it all looks similar, but some similarities in their goals, right? One of those goals was showing the benefit of a futurist society, a utopian-like society after the war, after Italy becomes a huge player and power in Europe. And another aim and goal that unifies this movement is showing just that, literally movement. So this is Giacomo Balla, the teacher. He was older and he taught Severini and Boccioni, who we just saw. And this is this really iconic piece by Giacomo Balla that shows a dog walking, kind of looks like my dog Cola, a little dachshund, walking so fast that its legs creates this blur of movement, and you can see the chain kind of whipping around. Love this piece, really interesting, beautiful. A difficult thing to try to show movement, right? And this sense of kinetic energy, and Balla shows it in this very famous painting. So kind of a layering of space and time and movement. Umberto Boccioni, who we saw with that painting, State of Mind, the farewells, the coming and going of the train station, also set out to create sculpture, what he called open sculpture, sculpture that wasn't reliant on lines and shapes, but was more fluid. Even though we can still see line and shapes, it's not set the rigidity of a figure. It's more the idea of the figure moving. Really interesting. He wanted to abstract it too. He didn't want you to think about this as a figure, but the forms of a figure moving through space. So it's called the unique forms of continuity in space. No lines, but more an emphasis of movement, similar to Giacomo Balla's dynamism of a dog on a leash. The next art movement that we're going to talk about is Russian abstraction. And one of the very first artists that we've talked about with abstraction was Kandinsky. And Kandinsky influenced this artist, Kazimir Malevich, who was a Russian artist, and starts a movement called Suprematism. And his early work, though, you can see as part of the Russian avant-garde, looks very, very cubist and futuristic, indebted to Braque and Picasso at the same time. But later, what he's doing is he's breaking all of these shapes and forms and figures in space down to simpler geometric shapes. He follows this to its natural conclusion, which is just geometric abstraction. This, even though he dated some of his paintings with impossibly early time periods, like he would say this painting from 1915, he might date it 1909 to make it look like he was the first to do abstraction. But really, we can date these through photographs. These no longer exist. These have since been destroyed. But this was a futurist exhibition in St. Petersburg, it's Petrograd, now St. Petersburg in Russia, dedicated to this idea of suprematism. That is the supreme visual phenomenon that the objective world is meaningless. The significant thing is a feeling, right? So that you shouldn't have to call into your work the subject matter of the real world. These things don't have to look like figures, people, trees, still lifes anymore. They're just geometric shapes in and of themselves, meant to be pleasing. And he saw these works as spiritual revelations, similar to Kandinsky. And I think it's interesting that two of the most important abstract artists in history both come from Russia. Kazimir Malevich and Vasily Kandinsky both come from Russia, and there's this sense of revolution, earlier folk traditions, new art, and a new revolution in terms of the Russian Revolution as well. New culture, new art, new government, new society structures, right? Later, with the new Russian government, after the rise of socialism, this work falls out of favor, and they actually prefer social realism. So Malevich kind of returns to a figurative work. Some people talked about these paintings as being the end of painting. A composition like this, suprematism, the supreme ideal of forms, that they're so reductionist, they're just reduced down to the simplest form. It's like, if you've painted nothing, what do you paint next? It's essentially almost like a white on white canvas, almost like a blank canvas, but he's doing something very, very subtle with that tilted square. And he did a lot of paintings of one color square on a composition. Now you might think this is kind of like the Emperor's New Clothes in a case of what's really there. You're saying this is important, but I don't really see it as important. But what he's done is he's taken the idea of cubism, right, and reduced it down to its simplest derivative form of just one cube. I personally think this was iconic, really important, beautiful. It also takes away the artist's hand. This becomes, where's a signature, right? This is less about the artist and more about the object. So a lot of these artists, abstract artists, stop signing their works, or they put the signature on the back, because if you had a big, huge signature down here, it would sort of take away from this minimalist statement. Really, really beautiful piece, really interesting, dynamic, and it goes back to what I said about abstract art, that sometimes it's the easiest art to understand. People want to know it has a grander meaning or significant, story behind it, but oftentimes it's the message, the meaning is just the way it looks. The functional, formal aspect are tied together here. And it's reflecting modern society, modern architecture, modern ideals with Cubism. Another Russian artist working in the same vein is L. Lissitzky. And L. Lissitzky does these works called prones. Prones is, we're not sure exactly what the origin is, or if it's a conflation or an abbreviation, or if it's a portmanteau of two separate words juxtaposition. But it might be an acronym. It's been suggested it's an acronym for the Project for the Affirmation of the New, but in Russian, and this is this abbreviation for that. Lissitzky's prones are compositions made of these very, very simple two-dimensional geometric arrangements, right? Beautiful work, and interesting materials as well in his works. This was a creation that he created an environment. Some of the earliest, later what we would call installation art, site-specific spaces of how materials can impact the room itself. So he's Russian, but he studies in Germany, goes back to Russia, goes back in the early Soviet period, and he makes works that are also representational. So he's doing both. And he saw the importance of representation in his work as well. So he wasn't like Malevich, who tries to get rid of figuration entirely, even though he returns later back to it. L. Lissitzky continually still works with the figure, even though he's working with geometric abstraction. We call this type of abstraction non-objective or non-referential because it's just about the shapes itself. It doesn't necessarily have to point to anything else. So this is non-objective. It's not meant to look like the objective world, and it's self-referential or non-referential geometric abstraction, which becomes really, really popular later in the United States. And this is its roots. Avant-garde, Russia, cultural new instigators of pushing the envelope of what could potentially happen with art. So this is a photograph. It's a double exposure. It's a self-portrait. L. Lissitzky, who was doing those prones, he does a self-portrait here in photography, this double exposed image, where you see the emphasis of him as a builder. He calls this piece the constructor, self-portrait, and then his eye connected to his hand, which I think is a beautiful metaphor about the artist's ability to see and to make and to create things, but responding to the modern world around him in works like this. And we can see also Kandinsky's work around the same time starts to evolve, starts to change a little bit. Remember, those earlier spiritual works were still indebted to the natural world and in music and in symphonies. But here, in a kind of a spiritual, and Kandinsky wrote a book around the same time called The Spiritual in Art, which is a great book. It's not a long read about concerning the spiritual in art. Great book, really short text, well written, just a kind of clear, evocative sense of what art could do and how it could trigger an emotional and spiritual response from the viewer, which is what Malevich was doing as well with his works. He felt like they were spiritual revelations, which later, one of my favorite artists is Mark Rothko, is definitely inspired by these two artists here. And Rothko was also a Russian artist, now from Latvia, the modern country of Latvia, part of Russia. So you can see this Russian influence becomes really important in modern art and the trajectory of modern art history. So this piece is much more cubist. So his work goes from being softer and more organic early in his career to now mid-career, it's much more linear and geometric, influenced by artists like Picasso and Braque, with a combination of like Fauvism and the colorful work of the Fauvists like Matisse. Now remember, Kandinsky was one of the original founders of Der Blue Reiter, meaning the Blue Rider, with Franz Marc and others. And you can kind of see now he's moving away from that as well. Kandinsky later leaves Russia, moves to Germany, and becomes a teacher at the Bauhaus, which, just like Peter Behrens, taught some of those important students like Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier. Kandinsky also taught the next wave of important artists as well. So he's an influential artist and also an influential teacher. The last artist that we will talk about, no, second to last artist that we'll talk about is Vladimir Tatlin, another Russian artist, and this movement called constructivism. That is thinking about the materials to construct. And so constructivism was first used by a group of Russian artists in the title of a 1922 exhibition of their work. And it's meant to kind of represent the style of Cubism, but a Russian variation of that, using various materials, most often industrial in nature and assembled, okay, putting those forms together as opposed to carving them or modeling them. So a new kind of construction, taking these industrial materials that aren't normally considered art, building with them and making a new art. This was also, so these no longer exist, but this is what he called his counter reliefs that were applied to walls. And in the tradition of Russia, it was very popular to have icon paintings that were high up on the wall, but sometimes at an angle. And we can see this in Malevich's work as well, and the work of L. Lissitzky, that sometimes these paintings would wrap around two walls. And this was in a home, you would put your icon painting there, your Russian pot painting of like the Virgin Mary or Christ at the intersection of these two walls, held at an angle. And El Lissitzky does that as well. So it's kind of like a new religion, a new place for icons, and these are geometric abstract. So instead of the place of the icon, you have this abstract work here. This later influences what we call installation art, but before installation art was really a thing, experiments with new materials. And Vladimir Tatlin said that he wanted to stay true to the materials. There was a certain truth to the materials, or there was a culture of materials that iron had a certain weight or value to it. Iron had a certain purpose, or iron had a certain symbolism when you looked at it. Wood, different weight, different value, different sense of use, or what, when you look at it, it gives you a certain association. He wanted to juxtapose those different associations, the truth to the materials themselves, what they could do, but also the culture of those materials and what they are used for. So this is an example of constructivism, and the two big artists for constructivism are Vladimir Tatlin and Rodchenko. This is a model for a monument to Russia, to the Third International, that was never constructed, but had it been constructed, and this is 20 foot tall, and this is in the State Russian Museum in St. Petersburg, and you can see the steps back here. Look at the scale. Here's a person standing here as an example for scale, and this is in a room. If this would have actually been built as a building, it was supposed to be a monument to Russia and house conference rooms on the inside. It was made of wood and iron and glass, and the building itself would have just been wrought iron, cast iron and glass, would have actually rotated, and it's in thirds. There's three different sections. The bigger section would rotate every year. The middle section would rotate every month, and the top section would rotate every single day. If it was built, it would have been constructed over 120 feet tall, bigger than the Eiffel Tower, which was the biggest metal structure at the time, but it was never actually, I said 100 feet, that's not that tall. 1,300 feet tall. This would have been the building, the tallest building of its time, much taller than the Eiffel Tower, and the biggest sculptural form ever made in history, but it was never constructed. It'd be cool, I think, to finally realize this, now that we have the technology to be able to do it. But it's one of those visionary architecture pieces, kind of a combination of art and architecture that's never fully realized. But there's this sense of newness in Russia that anything is possible. We're changing the name of the game culturally, artistically, and also religiously and politically, and the sense of optimism of what, hey, this is what the future could look like, should look like for us. Right? I think it's very inspirational and aspirational as well. The last artist that we'll talk about that is part of this Russian movement, constructivism, is Alexander Rodchenko. Rodchenko becomes very, very influential for constructivism and this juxtaposition of drawn, organic photography juxtaposed with the more geometric lettering and shapes that are used in these compositions. That kind of harkens back a little bit to Art Nouveau, but instead of being very, very organic, it's very dramatic and geometric. This later influences Russian propaganda, German Nazi propaganda, but this is cutting edge, and Rodchenko is one of the first to do these constructions, these juxtapositions of taking painting, graphic elements, photographic elements, and using them to create a sense of urgency of what our future reality might look like based on social ideals, socialism, the uniting of communism as well in Russia. So this is constructivism. The two important artists are Tatlin with his never constructed monument to the Third International, and Rodchenko and his experiments. He also was a sculptor and also had ideas about architecture, but here we see what he becomes most known for is these very graphic advertising pieces. This later becomes co-opted in modern, much more late modern advertising, like in the 80s and 90s, and actually a band, Franz Ferdinand, uses a lot of Rodchenko and constructivism motifs on their album art. If you've ever seen the band or heard the band Franz Ferdinand, they were heavily indebted. They actually co-opted this image for one of their album covers. But very influential and new and dynamic use of advertising, which later becomes Russian propaganda as well. Signing off, peace out. Remember, study up chapters 1 through 9. I'll give you all a bit of a review, and Friday is the test. If you have any questions, holler at me. Let me know. See y'all.